I think we've had the same sort of slide for all the other texts as well. Why is the Gospel of John written? The reason this is an important question for John, more so than the other Gospels, is because the other Gospels exist. I don't know many scholars who argue that John is written before Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in the last 20 years or so, more and more scholars have started to realize there has to be some connection between John and the Synoptics. That's this book that I pointed out last week, the fourth Synoptic Gospel. That's essentially the argument is John had to have known the Synoptics on some level. This book argues that he had them in front of him, essentially. But even outside of that argument, John chose to write a gospel as opposed to any other form of writing. And so on some level, he has to know that there are other gospels circulating and has to know or has to think that there is something deficient in those gospels, right? That his community would benefit from having a new gospel. Okay? The same way that John gives us more information about the author, John gives us more information about his purpose. So John actually tells us exactly why he is writing his gospel. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? So John 20, verse 31. He says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which aren't written in this book, but these are written. I wrote this book the way I did, so that, here's a purpose statement, you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. That's the end of the end of chapter 20. Scholars look at that and say that's a pretty good ending. And they will say 21 is an addendum. That the book ends in 20. The beloved disciple stopped writing in 20. And his community comes behind him to add 21 a little bit later. That's why you see he's the beloved disciple and it's his testimony, but we say these things because 21 is an addition. I don't really buy that, but the end of 20 is a great ending, right? I think the way I normally describe it is like the Return of the King, the last Lord of the Rings movie, how the way that they do it, there's like 10 different endings in the movie, right? So Frodo wakes up and he's in Rivendell and he has survived Mount Doom and Gandalf is there and Aragorn comes in and Legolas comes in and everybody's crying and it's beautiful and everybody's laughing kind of hysterically. And then it cuts to white, right? Great ending to a movie. But then it comes back and Aragorn is crowned king and he gets to marry Arwen and then he bows down in front of the hobbits and everybody's crying. And then it cuts to white. Great ending to a movie, right? And then the hobbits come back to the Shire and Sam gets married and all the hobbits are drinking at the pub where they started in the first movie. And then it cuts to white. Great ending to a movie. And then they all go to the Grey Havens and Frodo gets on the boat and Sam is crying. They're crying at the ending of all of these. And then it cuts to white as the boat goes off into the sunset. End of movie. And then Sam comes back and he's with Rosie and he's with his kids and it's in the Shire and he's writing the book and it goes on and on and on. And everyone is wrapping up these different versions of the story. He's tying up all these loose ends and it's ending these different portions of it. I think that's what's happening here. That John 20 is the ending of this whole book about Jesus' glory. And John 21 is an ending for the whole gospel itself. Okay, we'll get to this in a minute. But all that to say, he explicitly tells us the purpose. And he says it's so that you may come to believe. And he writes this word. It's one word in Greek. And there's debate about what this means. Yeah, there's a textual variant, which means some manuscripts have a slightly different word. It's the same verb with a different ending. And even if you don't go with the variant, the word itself can mean multiple things. So sometimes it can mean like new belief, that you would come to believe, that faith would be generated within you. And sometimes it can mean like strengthened in belief. And this is important because it could go either way, and we don't really know what it means. Is the text written for non-believers in order to generate faith within them to convert them? Or is it written for a community of believers to strengthen their belief? Those are two very different ideas. Some people will just say, oh, well, it's both. The Greek word can mean both, so it's intended to be both. It's intended, like any good sermon, to edify believers and to witness to non-believers, right? Any good sermon that you preach, you should have in mind, if somebody comes in off the street, will my sermon help them see Jesus? But also, if an 80-year-old believer is in the room who has been a believer for 80 years, will they get something out of the sermon, right? And balancing both of those polarities is difficult. And that's kind of what good sermon writing accomplishes. Maybe John is trying to do something like that. I think we'll go ahead and talk about it here. There's, like I said, there's debate about all of this stuff. We'll talk about it more when we get to the audience. So let's leave it here for now. Any questions on this with the purpose of the text? It kind of very clearly defines why it's written for whatever this is, to generate belief, to strengthen belief, whatever it is. Okay. I don't have really anything insightful to say about the date. I think most scholars will say that it's written after Mark and Matthew and Luke, which just pushes it back and back and back. If you're saying the beloved disciple is an eyewitness of Jesus, there's a time limit for that, right? If John, the son of Zebedee, is a teenager when Jesus dies, which is possible, say he's 18 when Jesus dies in the year 29. So if he's 18 at 29, realistically, how old could he be by the time he dies? Right? I mean, realistically, he could live to 60, hypothetically 80, but like not really. So that really pushes you for, say he lived to be, miraculously, he lived to be 68, right? That would put you at the year 99. But that still seems like a stretch, right? That he would live this long and be able to write a book before he dies. It seems like a stretch. If you have him dying and then the community coming along and writing a book about him, about his testimony, that might help you to adjust the dates a little bit. Ironically, we think that John is the last gospel written, but the earliest manuscript that we have of anything in the whole New Testament comes from John. It's kind of just like a coincidence of history, right? Where we know that there are texts, right? Paul is written in the 40s, right? Romans and Galatians and all this stuff is written very early. And we don't have copies of that until after we have John, which we think is like 50 years after Paul. But there's a little fragment. It's called P52. I don't know how big your screen is, but P52 is essentially like this big. I mean, it's a tiny little fragment. It's got a few words from, I think, John 17 on it. And we date it to probably AD 125. And it's the earliest thing of anything in the whole New Testament that we have. Ironically, it comes from John. But this puts a really firm end date for how late John could possibly be. This is discovered in Egypt. And so, like, given, timing for circulation and whatever else, I don't know anyone who could argue that John is written after, say, 115 at the latest. Some scholars will try to say, well, John is obviously written late because it has such a high Christology. It starts off and says that Jesus is God, and Christians didn't invent that theology until way later. I think that's a silly argument because, like, Paul is running around in the 40s saying that Jesus is God and writing about it. And so this idea that high Christology develops later, I don't think that's a solid argument for dating John at all. But I do think the temple's gone, right? And I do think Mark and Matthew and John and Luke are written already. And so I'm very comfortable with like a AD 90 for John being written. Sometime in this time period, however that works out. I know a lot of people who try to push it really early, and I just don't see a need for that theologically. Like, it doesn't really bother me. It doesn't make it less trustworthy to me if it's written in 90 instead of 60. Does this make sense? Good. Okay. Now, the last kind of big question here is the audience. Who is John written for? And this goes back to how you understand the purpose. If it's written to strengthen the belief of Christians, then obviously it's written for a Christian community. And if it's written to evangelize, then obviously it's written for non-Christians. And there is so much debate about this. There's really no consensus within the scholarship. Essentially, there's four arguments, four categories. So I'll write a little chart. There's Jews or Gentiles, and there's Christians or non-Christians. And you could pick a scholar, and they'll argue one of these four boxes. Draw this here to make it boxes. They will argue that the audience is somewhere in here. And nobody is in agreement about this. If you pull, the top 100 Johannine scholars, you'd probably find at least 10 in each of these boxes. There's just not really a big consensus. I think evangelicals historically have been over here in this box, because this would say that it's an evangelical document written to convert Jews into Christianity. So he produced the text, John produced the text, in order to convince Jews that Jesus is their Messiah. Does anybody see a glaring issue with this interpretation? John says a lot of very problematic things about the Jews. Probably the worst of which is Jesus says, "You Jews are children of your father, the devil." There are a lot of issues in John regarding Judaism, regarding the Jews. And we'll talk about that later. But the question for me is, how effective would this be as an evangelical document reaching out to Jews if it says such harsh things about the Jews? I don't really know. So other folks have tried to address that issue to say, no, it's not written for non-Christian Jews to convert them. It's actually written for, so this is another scholarly argument, it's written for Jewish Christians. Maybe it's written for Jewish Christians who have been expelled from the synagogue. And maybe they now need a new way to identify themselves since they've been removed from synagogue practice. Some scholars have come along and said, well, this doesn't seem like a great answer either, because John explains certain Jewish practices. Think of the wedding at Cana. They had these 5 big cisterns of water, and John explains they were for Jewish ritual purification. If you were a lifelong Jew, nobody needs to explain that to you, right? So then scholars come along and they say, oh, well, because he's explaining these things, maybe it's written for Gentile Christians. Maybe it's in this box instead. That they're Christians, they're Gentiles. They need to know how they're connected to Judaism, but it's okay if we say harsh things about Judaism because they're not Jews. So it's fine. One book that came out, I think 10 years ago now, it's by Adele Reinhardt. It's called Cast Out of the Covenant. And I'll put this here. She envisions that the text is written as a conversion tool for Gentiles, for non-Jews. In her approximation, the text is written in a way that appeals to Gentiles, and one specific tool that the text uses to bring Gentiles in is a shared enemy, the Jews. So the text is intentionally harsh to the Jews, makes fun of and ridicules and puts down the Jews in order to bring in the Gentiles who might already have negative opinions of the Jews. And if we have a shared enemy, a shared person that we can make fun of together, that might be an appealing rhetorical device. I don't know how much I like that argument, but in her conception, she's saying essentially the text is designed to be read aloud in a Gentile marketplace, an agora. And I kind of like that idea, that someone would have memorized the Gospel of John and go downtown to the city square and preach by reciting the whole Gospel of John. And that the Gospel of John would be an effective evangelical tool to bring in converts. Like, imagine if you went downtown where the trees lit up and you just recited the whole Gospel of John and people became believers because of it. I kind of like that. I kind of think it's a cool historical vision. I don't know how true it is. I like the idea of it. I just don't know if it's accurate or not. All this to say, there's really no consensus on this. Good? Okay, any questions on any of this sort of stuff so far? All right, I think I have a slide that has our outline, but I think we'll talk about this more next time we get together. And I think this is a remnant from previous iterations of this class, so I might disagree with this. The main thing with John is what you see up here, Book of Signs and Book of Glory. Everybody agrees John is essentially written in two books, split on chapter 12. That 12 is this hinge. The Book of Signs is Jesus performing signs to point to his identity as the Messiah, as the Son of God. And when that doesn't work, he shifts to an interior private ministry with just his disciples pointed toward the cross. And some scholars will argue that the author of the text had two different sources, a Book of Signs where he had all these miracle stories, and a Book of Glory where he had these internal testimony stories. We don't really know that. Everybody kind of agrees that there's this Book of Signs and Book of Glory. But I think we'll get into this a little bit more when we actually get into the text next time. So we can skip ahead for now. Okay, I want to talk about themes, huge motifs that are throughout John. I don't know that we've taken time in the other Gospels to do this. I think we've pointed them out maybe at the beginning or maybe as we go through. John is full of this stuff. And so I want to point it out at the beginning so that when we're going through the text, any of you can raise your hand and say, oh, this is one of these themes. Oh, it popped up here again. Oh, I see it here again. John is very good at this, where he will, even at the beginning, we read John 1 at the very beginning of class. He starts off and tells this story, and he lays out that there are going to be all of these themes, even at the beginning, and then he teases them out throughout the rest of the story. You consistently see ascending and descending, people coming down or people coming up. I guess the best way to explain this is, one, the Son of Man, right? Jesus himself comes down, the Word comes down. And two, Jesus always talks about the Son of Man being lifted up, him ascending. And at first in the gospel, you're supposed to think this means he will be exalted, that he will be lifted up, he will receive fame, he will be well revered for the community. But then after he's rejected, the lifting up turns into something else. And then the gospel starts to teach you, what does it mean when it says Jesus is going to be lifted up? Well, really, it means he's going to be lifted up on the cross. And the author, while he's been saying Jesus is going to be exalted, now he starts to reveal, actually, he's going to be exalted through crucifixion. And so he has this motif where he's building it up in your mind as the audience that Jesus will be exalted by the end of this story. And then the surprise is that the exaltation actually comes through his death. Not exactly what you were expecting. He also teases out this light and darkness. I think we read that, John 1:5, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness didn't overcome it. I assume most of your translations say something about overcome the darkness. The word here in Greek can mean overcome, like I use my power to subdue you, but it can also mean intellectual assent. The only word in English that I know of that has both of those meanings is the word grasp. Like you can grasp your opponent in wrestling and subdue them, or you can grasp an idea intellectually, right? So some translations would say the darkness doesn't understand the light, or the darkness doesn't overcome the light. I think the author means both. Throughout the text, you consistently see people in darkness do not understand what Jesus is talking about. And also, people in darkness have no power to stop Jesus' light from coming. The metaphor is powerful. And John is not the first one to come up with this metaphor, right? If you're in a completely black room and you light a candle, the room is no longer black, right? Because just like physically, light has a power to dispel darkness. And in the ancient world, everybody kind of knows this. So John is really tapping into something that everybody's very familiar with and using it to describe Jesus. And he does this consistently, and it's always great. Think about when Nicodemus comes and talks to Jesus in John 3. What is the time of day that Nicodemus comes? It's nighttime. It's the middle of the night that Nicodemus comes. Does Nicodemus walk away believing or not? Not. And we as the audience know that from the beginning. At the beginning of the story, it tells us Nicodemus came at night, and you are instantly supposed to know he's not going to get it. Now, that's John 3. Go to John 4, the Samaritan woman at the well. What time of day is it? It's noon. It's broad daylight. And does she get it? Definitely. And you know she's going to get it before they ever say a word because it's daytime and they're in the light. And because she's coming to him in the light, it works out and she's going to be a believer. The other example that I really like is in John, they have like the Last Supper scene. It's actually, I don't think Judas participates in the Last Supper in John, but Jesus sends Judas out to go and betray him. And it says that Judas left his company, he left Jesus, and the gospel author takes the time to tell you, and it was night. Judas has left the light and is now in darkness by himself. The theme of light and darkness is consistent. You even see it in 1 John, which we won't really get into in this class. But when we're talking about the Johannine community, scholars will argue it's this community that writes the Gospel of John, 1, 2, 3 John, and Revelation. It might be the same person writing them. It might be different people writing them. But they all have the same shared language of light and darkness, of walking in the light, of loving one another, all this sort of stuff. Okay. Another theme in John is connections between seeing and believing. And again, we have this in our vernacular in English. You can see things physically with your eyes, but seeing also means that you understand something intellectually. Somebody explains something to you and you say, oh, I see, right? That there is this connection between the visual aspect of what your eyes do, but also going through your eyes to your brain to enlightenment. And John will tease this out over the course of the gospel. This is something that I argued in my master's thesis to say, in the book of signs, Jesus is consistently operating with seeing and hearing as the methods of belief that people can see and hear and believe based on that. You see this with the man born blind in John 9. In John 12, the ministry is not really successful. And Jesus kind of shuts down the ministry. And when he does so, John quotes Isaiah 6, which we've talked about in our class before, The synoptics quote Isaiah 6 as a reference to why Jesus teaches in parables. It's so that seeing they'll see but not see, and hearing they'll hear but not hear, and with their hearts they won't understand, right? John uses that verse, but he intentionally changes the verse. He switches around the word order and he drops out hearing altogether. So he says, seeing they won't perceive, and understanding they won't believe. But John also changes the verb tense to say, God is the one that's doing it. God is preventing people from seeing, and God is preventing people from believing. And the way that this works out rhetorically, by the end of the gospel, you have Thomas, who is doubting because he hasn't seen physically the stuff on Jesus's body. He hasn't seen the resurrected Jesus, and he refuses to believe. So when Jesus does come and prove himself to Thomas, what does Jesus say? You have seen and therefore believed. Blessed are you for believing. Even more blessed are those who believe without seeing. So think about this rhetorically. If you're in an audience in the 2nd century and you're hearing this gospel, you think, well, man, I wish that I would have been there to see these miracles that Jesus performed. I wish that I would have been there to see the risen Jesus in his resurrected body. I didn't see any of that stuff. Maybe I won't be able to believe. And even in the text itself, it's telling you, no, actually, you are more blessed when you believe than Thomas is, even though he saw the resurrected Jesus. Rhetorically, the whole book is designed to say, your belief should not be based on the things that you see. It should be based on the things that you hear. Specifically, this gospel that you're hearing right now, right? And if you believe based on this testimony you hear right now, you'll be even more blessed than Peter or John or Thomas or the beloved disciple, because your believing is based on hearing. Good on this? Another big thing is this insiders and outsiders. John talks about the world and how the world just doesn't understand him. John is, I think, this isn't just like me as a Calvinist saying this, I think most scholars agree, it is the more predestinarian of the Gospels. You know, you could make an argument for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not really predestination. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. John has a lot of texts that have a lot of implications. He talks about sheep, and he says, if you are my sheep, you will believe what I say to you. And the reason you don't believe is because you're not my sheep. Essentially what he's saying is, if you belong to the world, you will never understand my testimony. It's not that you accept my testimony and then you become my sheep. It's actually the opposite. Either you belong to God and God will give you to me, or you don't belong to God and you don't want anything to do with me. This insider and outsider stuff really takes a center stage when you start looking at the way that the gospel talks about the Jews. The Jews, I have a whole slide for it later, I don't know if we'll get to it today, are really seen as outsiders. And it becomes problematic when you think about, like, Jesus and all his disciples are Jews. But it really plays into this idea of insiders and outsiders. And John is unique in that in the synoptics, you have a lot of texts that talk about bless those who persecute you, love your enemies, do good to those who do evil against you. Really nice Christian stuff, right? John doesn't have that stuff. When John gives you commands to love, it's almost always love each other. Love my sheep. Take care of each other, honor each other, wash each other's feet, and stay away from everybody on the outside, right? He doesn't say people will know you're my disciple by the way that you love the world. He says people will know you're my disciple by the way you love each other. Disciples taking care of and loving other disciples. This is different. This gives people the idea that in John's time, when he's writing, there is some sort of external conflict. That John's community is in conflict with the world, and he is doubling down on this idea of we as a community need to take care of each other. And we need to insulate ourselves against the world who's trying to get us. There's also a ton of symbolic imagery. You can see this throughout water and light and blood and all of these things throughout. And we'll get to this when we're going through the text over the next couple of days. The last thing is irony. One way to understand this is like misunderstanding. I think the best example of this is when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and Jesus says, unless one is born, and he says anothen in Greek. And this can mean from above or again. Unless one is born again, unless one is born from above, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, someone could very easily hear Jesus say this and say, how could one be born from above? Explain that to me. Nicodemus does not take that route. He, it seems, intentionally misunderstands Jesus and chooses a second meaning of the word and kind of makes fun of Jesus. The way that I picture this is Jesus is with his disciples and Nicodemus is with his disciples, and they're having this conversation, which seems amicable, but it's very much intended. I'm hoping to get a zinger on you so that my disciples will know that I win the argument. And this is what Nicodemus comes in trying to do. So the way that I picture it is like they're both in, I'm picturing like high school drama gangs fighting each other. And it's the leader of both the gangs that are like ribbing on each other, And so Nicodemus comes and says, well, how could one be born again? Am I supposed to crawl back inside my mom and be born again? Ha, ha, ha. And then the guys behind him are supposed to be laughing because it's silly. Obviously, Jesus is not intending it to be that, but he also is using a word that has a meaning, but is open to a double interpretation, right? And Nicodemus is just choosing to misunderstand. The irony being, we as the audience know that Nicodemus gets it totally wrong. We know things, we are given information that the characters in the story are not. This is like the, this is what a sitcom is. If you're familiar with like modern TV, it's a situational comedy. That's what sitcom stands for. And we call it that because it's situational irony. You as the audience know things that the characters don't, and that's why it's funny. What was it? Everybody Loves Raymond, if you remember from like the 90s. That was typically what they did. Raymond would go off and do something, trying to be helpful, not knowing that it's actually going exactly against what the people want him to do. I think we might have talked about this in a different class. The like classic literature example of this is called The Necklace. I think it's a short story. I think it's Guy de Maupassant who wrote it. And it's essentially two poor people want to get each other gifts because they love each other so much. They're married and they want to take care of each other. She has long, beautiful hair, and his one like treasure in his life is this pocket watch that he has. So he goes and sells his pocket watch to buy a brush for his wife's beautiful hair. And his wife cuts her hair and sells it to buy a gold chain for the pocket watch. And they give each other the gifts, and it kind of, both of them love each other so much, but also you shouldn't have done that. It is situational irony because you as the audience know exactly what's happening the whole time. And it's not until the end that the characters realize it. John does this throughout, where you as the audience know stuff that's going on that nobody else does. You know who Jesus is the whole time. So when people are bumbling around like blind fools, it's funny. It's comical, the stuff that's going on. One last example of this before we go. Jesus is God walking around in the flesh. John tells us that at the beginning. God self-identifies in the burning bush as, we would say, Yahweh. Jews don't really say this word, so they normally say the Lord in all caps to avoid saying the tetragrammaton up here. But it is some sort of word that means like self-revelation, being. We translate it a lot of the time as I am, right? And John famously has Jesus saying these I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, et cetera, et cetera. When Jesus goes to be arrested, the soldiers, and the way that John describes it, it is a legion of Roman soldiers. John uses the word for 500 Roman soldiers in arms, wearing golden armor, coming to this garden to arrest an unarmed Jew. Okay? And they say, we are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And what does Jesus say to them? Anybody? So they say, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus says, I am. And the text tells you all 500 soldiers fall down because Jesus has revealed himself as God, and the power of this revelation makes all the soldiers fall down on their feet, off their feet. Okay? And then they're all kind of like, I picture them all stumbling to try to get back. They're putting their staves down on the ground and pulling themselves back up. There's 500 of them. It's hilarious. And then Jesus is just like looking at his watch and waiting for them to get back up. And he says, tell me, who are you looking for? Or he says something like that. And then he says, come on, I'm waiting for you guys. I already told you that I am. And he says it again. And I picture all of them falling over again. It is hugely comical because you as the audience know who Jesus is. You know that he's this pre-incarnate word that's just wrapped in flesh, right? The soldiers don't know this, but even if the soldiers don't know this, why are there so many of them, right? Why do they need 500 of them to arrest this one unarmed Jew, right? So either they're incompetent, they're sending way too many people, or maybe they do think that he's God and they haven't sent nearly enough soldiers, because he could say one word in Aramaic and all of them fall down, which is hilarious, right? And John does this throughout the gospel. It's really great. If you read the gospel in this way, as a comedy, as you are privy to information that nobody else is, it really does read like a narrative. It really does read like it should be performed on stage. It's really good. When we get back on Thursday, we'll keep going with some more of these notes about the gospel as a whole. We need to look at the signs. We need to look at his use of the term the Jews, and then we'll look at the I am statements more, just a little. And then we'll just get into the gospel itself. And we'll do the same thing, and we'll start with John 1 and try to get through the rest of the stories. Okay?